The Brinks-Mat Heist. A short story based on true events. November 26, 1983. Heathrow's shadowed trading estate was cloaked in a choking fog that seemed to cling to every surface, wrapping the sprawling maze of warehouses and docks in damp secrecy. Dawn hesitated, reluctant to break the heavy silence, as if the very air was holding its breath. Only the faint hum of electricity from overhead sodium lamps broke the stillness, echoing softly through the mist. Mickey McAvoy leaned against the battered, dull white van, eyes fixed on the warehouse silhouette through the fog. He drew a slow, deliberate drag from his silk cut, the cherry ember flickering in the gloom. The cold nipped at his neck, but his focus was steely, calculating. Behind him, 5 men in identical overalls and masks waited in silence. Ordinary men, if you saw them on the street. Invisible in plain sight. Mickey flicked his cigarette aside and whispered low, "Right, boys, no faffing about. We're in and out like wind. No names, no shouting. If you see a guard, you smile, then make him sit down sharpish." His voice was calm, but each word carried weight, born of experience. Mickey wasn't just muscle, he was the architect. Raised amid South London's grey estates, he'd moved from petty theft to armed robbery, like a man moving from school to work. But this job, this would crown him king. Among the crew was Tony White, Mickey's right hand, a quiet brute with the build of a dock worker and eyes that had seen too many pub fights go sideways. Next to him stood Brian Basil Reeder, wiry and twitchy, always fiddling with his gloves. He wasn't built for violence but could crack a safe faster than most people opened crisps. They moved with eerie confidence toward the warehouse gate. Tony produced a key, fresh from inside help, and whispered, "From Tony Black, straight from the source." The lock clicked open, like a secret unfolding. Inside, the hum of fluorescent lights and the chatter of bored guards filled the air. 2 men sat at a small table, drinking tea and reading the morning paper, unaware of what was about to happen. Mickey's heart hammered softly. This was the moment that could rewrite everything. "Oi," said one guard, glancing up. "You lot are early. What's the—" Before he finished, Tony White stepped forward, revolver in hand, voice deadly and low. "Hands up. No talking. Do exactly as you're told, and you'll walk out breathing." Mickey followed, face tight beneath his mask. "This ain't personal, lads, but if you move, you get burned. Understand?" They were bound swiftly, cable ties biting into wrists, duct tape silencing protests. Mickey leaned close, gravelly voice in their ears. "You don't know what we're after, and if you keep your mouth shut, you never will." Yet, in truth, they did know, at least enough. Everyone in the underground circuit had heard whispers. Behind the locked doors of Brinks-Mat, there was more than just cash. Something more precious. Something worth dying for. 3 weeks earlier, Tony Black sat across from Brian Robinson in a dim corner of the Coach and Horses, a smoky South London pub reeking of stale beer and sweat. The place was a refuge for those who drank to forget or to remember. Tony, in his late 30s, tall and lanky, with greasy hair that never quite washed clean, had a nervous energy that betrayed his quiet desperation. His life was a routine. Saturday football, Friday pints, a marriage unraveling under debts and disappointment. He'd never crossed the line in his life. Until now. Across from him, Brian Robinson, 10 years his senior, looked like a man who'd seen it all and learned to hide it. A former prisoner, a strategist, a man who saw every angle and exploited it. "You trust me, don't you, Tone?" Brian asked, smooth but sharp. Tony hesitated, fingering a battered beer mat. "Your family, Brian, but this is big." Brian leaned in, eyes cold and calculating. "All I need's the routine. Don't even have to touch anything. Just tell me how the place works, who's there, when. What code you punch in to keep the alarms quiet? Tony hesitated again, guilt gnawing at him. But beneath that, a gnawing insignificance grew. Working security paid pennies, his marriage was strained, and debts had become monsters. You said no one would get hurt, he finally muttered. I give you my word, Brian replied, calm as a still pond. In and out, quiet as ghosts. No one lays a finger. Tony took a long, bitter sip. Codes 1256. Outer gates in a red tin near the door. Vault keys on me. I lock up every Friday night. Brian's faint smile was cloaked in sympathy. You just bought yourself a one-way ticket out of this shithole, mate. But Tony felt no relief. Only a growing certainty that he'd crossed a line from which there was no return. November 26, 1983, 6:40 a.m. The fluorescent lights of the warehouse buzzed faintly, casting a stark, clinical glow over the cold, concrete floor. Shadows flickered across towering stacks of cargo, silent sentinels to what was about to unfold. Outside, the fog curled like smoke from an unseen fire, swallowing everything in a ghostly shroud. Inside, time seemed frozen. 2 security guards sat tied to chairs, their mouths gagged with duct tape, trembling in terror. Trevor Dean, a quiet man with glasses and a wife and children waiting at home, had soiled himself in fear. Charlie Henley, older and hardened, stared straight ahead with a fierce glare, jaw clenched tight. Mickey McAvoy knelt before Charlie, gazing into his eyes beneath his mask. Look, Mickey said softly, almost kindly. I don't like doing this. But you give us grief. I promise you'll leave in a bin bag. Nod if you understand. Charlie's jaw clenched. Mickey slapped him lightly, just enough to make the point. Nod, mate. Charlie blinked once, slowly, then nodded. Good lad. Mickey turned back toward the vault, heart pounding like a war drum. This was the moment everything depended on. Tony White, mostly silent all morning, now knelt at the keypad, breath fogging the steel as he typed in 1256. The lock groaned open with a low, ominous sound, as if awakening from centuries of slumber. They expected cash, maybe £3 million in notes, tops. That was the word Tony Black had spread. Enough to disappear. Enough for Mickey to retire in the Algarve, never hearing sirens again. But what they uncovered was something else entirely. As the vault door swung open, Brian Robinson stepped inside first, shotgun ready. He froze. Rows of dull yellow bars, stacked waist-high, lined the shelves. Dozens, hundreds, all in neat formation like silent soldiers. The bullion shimmered in the sterile light. Crates marked De Beers held glints of diamonds. In another corner, zipped bags of travelers' checks sat in silence. Nobody moved. Christ, Brian whispered, eyes wide. This isn't just cash. Gold, Mickey said softly, stunned. It's all gold. Eddie Copeland, the youngest of the crew, peeled off his balaclava and stared. That can't be. There's got to be 20 tons of it. Closer to 3 tons, Brian corrected, kneeling to run his fingers along a bar. Sovereign pure. Worth more than the Queen's crown. The crew hurried, loading crates, breathing hard, muscles aching under the weight. Outside, Heathrow was just starting to stir. Inside, history was being rewritten. Eddie nearly dropped a bar. Tony grabbed it in time. Be careful, you idiot, Tony hissed. That's someone's pension. Or someone's tombstone, Brian grimly added. When the van was finally full, they stood in the empty vault, panting and exhausted. The crates were gone, alarms silent, guards stunned. It felt almost too easy. That's when Mickey made a decision that haunted him forever. He moved to the guards, peeled off the tape from Charlie's mouth. You're going to tell the police it was 6 men. That's all. 6 men. Black overalls, balaclavas. One of us had a limp. Make it up if you have to. What is this? Charlie rasped. You don't even know what you've stolen. Mickey offered a thin, cold smile. You'd be surprised. But I'll tell you what it ain't. It ain't your problem anymore. Then he turned, leading the gang out to the van. They climbed in, doors shut tight. Mickey started the engine. Nobody talks, he said, eyes flickering in the mirror. Not today, not next year, not ever. This gold, this job never happened. It's not cash. We can't spend it like cash. From now on, we're ghosts. The van slipped into the fog, leaving the silence of the warehouse behind. The guards sat stunned in the empty vault, staring at over £26 million worth of gold, the largest robbery in British history, yet unaware that their lives had just been forever changed, that this moment was only the beginning of a new, darker chapter. Late November, 1983. The fog from Heathrow still cloaked the landscape when the enormity of what they'd stolen began to settle like a stone in their stomachs. By Monday morning, headlines blared across the papers. £26 million Brinks-Mat robbery, largest in British history. But headlines were only the surface. Beneath the words was a deeper, darker story about the gold itself. Untraceable in theory, impossible to spend in bulk, it was a treasure that attracted predators across the underworld. Mickey McAvoy knew someone who could help. Kenneth Noy, infamous in underground circles as the Alchemist of Kent. Noy's estate was a fortress. High gates, electrified fences, and a garden shed turned into a smelting lab. Mickey arrived alone in an inconspicuous Ford Escort, not wanting to bring his crew. Inside, Noy sat cross-legged on a velvet chaise reading a book on commodities, with a large black Doberman at his side. Mickey laid a small black briefcase on the table, revealing a single gold bar, a sample of the over 400 he carried. Noy picked it up, turning it over, examining the serial number. Brinks-Mat? He asked softly. Yes, Mickey replied. Noy's eyes narrowed. You're either a genius, he said, or a bloody idiot. Can I move it? Mickey asked cautiously. Noy's smile was cold. I can move anything, he said, but not quickly, not safely, unless it's changed. Changed how? Mickey prompted. Noy stood, robe swirling. He looked out over his frost-covered garden. Gold's like blood, he said quietly. It leaves a signature. I melt it down, mix it with copper, silver, alter the ratios. Then we cast it anew. No history, no trace. How long? Mickey asked. Depends. Small shipments across Switzerland, the Gulf, even back here. It's a process. Slow but sure. Mickey watched him carefully. You've done this before. Noy turned, eyes cold. You don't build a fence for stolen stereos. He smiled darkly. Over the next days, Mickey and Brian's crew moved small loads of bullion into safe houses. Garages, lockups, buried in drums beneath Surrey soil. Noy's operation was cold, precise, terrifying. An industrial furnace in Dartford, a scrapyard turned melting plant. Processed the gold, serial numbers erased, alloys mixed, new bars poured. Invoices and documents were forged, the gold reborn. The profits flowed through shell companies, fronts in Switzerland, Panama, the Channel Islands. Mickey opened accounts in Gibraltar. Brian invested in dubious imports. Eddie bought a Chelsea flat, filling it with mahogany furniture, dreaming of respectability. But paranoia crept in. Every knock, every bark of a dog felt like a threat. Noy warned softly, you think you're safe now. The gold's cursed, spend it and it pulls tighter. Disappear, blend, don't talk. But the roots of greed ran deep. No one could escape forever. Winter 1983. Scotland Yard's flying squad offices were always heavy with tension, even in cold months. Tobacco smoke curled beneath flickering fluorescents, while weak sunlight seeped through Venetian blinds. Coffee cups and crime scene photos cluttered every desk. Detective Chief Superintendent Brian Boyce had seen his share of robberies. Armoured vans, payroll snatches, post office jobs. But this was different. Brinks-Mat wasn't just a heist, it was a declaration. £26 million in gold doesn't vanish, he said, pacing before his team. Not unless there's a bloody network moving it. He pointed at the whiteboard. A web of names, photos, arrows, most question marks. At its center, a fuzzy CCTV still of Brian Robinson, marked in red. We find who's fencing this gold, we find our crew. But leads were scarce. The vault security had not been broken. It had been opened. Someone inside had held the keys. Tony Black sat alone in his Lambeth flat, walls yellowed with age and smoke. Outside, Christmas lights flickered. He hadn't slept. Every sound felt like sirens. Every phone ring made his stomach turn. He watched the news, horrified at the size of the haul in that vault. Fewer millions than he'd imagined, yet enough to drown him in guilt. His girlfriend Jenny sensed something was wrong. He wasn't eating. He snapped at the TV. One night she found him crying in the bathroom. "Tony, what have you done?" she asked. He looked at her with red-rimmed eyes. "They'll kill me if I talk," he whispered. "But if I don't, they will." The pressure was relentless. The police visited everyone involved in the security. Tony was questioned repeatedly. His answers became muddled. Finally he cracked, signing a statement. Boyce looked at him across the table. "Your brother-in-law was behind it?" Tony nodded, tears falling. "Brian Robinson. He asked about the vault, the keys, the alarms. And you gave him everything?" Tony's confession exploded like a bomb. Robinson got the call while sitting at an Islington cafe. Mickey stepped out to make a call. The phone rang. The curt voice knew Mickey's paid monitor. "Tony's talked. They're coming." The line went dead. Mickey returned, eyes wild. "He's sold us out." "Who?" Mickey asked. "I'm Tony. That little bastard." Silence. Mickey finally said, "We get out now. Drop everything. Burn the phones. Split and vanish." But the gears were already turning. By early 1984, Robinson was arrested at his cousin's flat. Mickey was nabbed days later at a Bermondsey pub. He didn't resist. At the station, Boyce offered him a cigarette. Mickey took it, lit it, exhaled. "We'll get you for all of it," Boyce said. Mickey smirked. "Then prove it." But Mickey had underestimated Tony Black's cooperation. He'd provided detailed maps, names, times, and even Brian's words that night. As Mickey and Brian sat behind bars, their operation unraveled. Surveillance targeted garages, scrapyards, and noise contacts. Noy himself was no ordinary fence. He had friends in high places, corrupt customs, crooked solicitors, cops on payroll. They knew he was melting the gold but couldn't catch him, so they sent in an undercover. In spring 1984, DC John Fordham posed as a surveyor near Noy's estate. Suspicion grew. One night, dogs barked, lights flashed. Noy caught someone near his perimeter. A struggle ensued. Fordham was stabbed to death. Noy claimed self-defense. The courts believed him, and he walked free. The arrests of Mickey and Brian sent shockwaves through the underworld. They were legends, now prisoners. Mickey kept silent, refusing deals. Brian, loyal to the end, said nothing. But the gold? Most of it had vanished, laundered, sold, hidden. Scotland Yard recovered some, but most had disappeared into offshore vaults or melted into jewellery and electronics. Boyce's whiteboard bore the names Black, Robinson, McAvoy, all crossed out. But Noy's photo remained, untouched. "You don't just move 26 million, Boyce muttered. "You build an empire. And empires, no matter how carefully built, begin to crack." Spring 1985 to 1985. South London. Newspapers called it the heist of the century, the theft of £26 million in bullion, gone without a single shot fired. But the real story wasn't in headlines. It was in alleyways, in abandoned cars, in whispered rumours. The gold wasn't just wealth, it was power, and power, once gained, rarely travels quietly. In a pub off the Old Kent Road, Johnny the Lip Palmer nervously tapped his pint. "They're killing people now," he murmured to his companion. Charlie Kane, a mid-level mover with Turkish connections, nodded grimly. "Too many with their beaks in. Someone talks, they die." Johnny glanced around and lowered his voice. "You hear about Snowy?" "What about him?" "They found him in a ditch, head like mashed beetroot." Charlie didn't flinch. That made two men linked to the laundered gold turning up dead in weeks. No one claimed responsibility. No firm, no traveller, not even the Arif brothers pushing in from the Turkish quarter. The gold had attracted predators. Meanwhile, in West Kingsdown, Kent, Kenneth Noy watched chaos unfold like a king observing rival dukes. To outsiders, he was a successful businessman. Import-export, property, offshore investments. But inside, he had turned a garden shed into a smelting lab. Gold bars were melted, adulterated with copper and silver, then recast into new, untraceable bars. "Gold's like a ghost," he told his Irish associate, John Fatty Cashman. "It forgets where it's been if you melt it enough times." But even Noy's confidence waned. The police had eyes on him. The criminal world whispered. By 1985, nearly £13 million had been successfully laundered. Some even returned to the Bank of England as legal supply. Meanwhile, Mickey and Brian served their sentences. Mickey, older, colder, his face like iron. Brian haunted by snatched whispers from outside. One night, in the yard, Brian admitted, "We trusted too many." Mickey simply replied, "No, we trusted the wrong ones." Newspapers returned to the prison library, obituaries read daily. Then came the brutal deaths. Cliff Sachs, shot outside his shop. Charlie Wilson gunned down in Marbella. Anthony Barry found hanging. Everyone connected, everyone touched by the gold. Detective Boyce stared at his map. Pins across London, Kent, Marbella. Bodies erased, secrets buried. The gold had gone far, into jewelers' showcases, electronics, even funding the cocaine boom. It had seeded a new generation of white-collar criminals. Fraudsters, launderers, empire builders. And the cracks widened. Noy, paranoid, moved operations offshore, installed cameras, and fired staff. Yet the flow of gold continued. And so did the violence. Hidden, relentless, waiting. By the 1990s, the gold had fallen silent. Nearly a decade since Heathrow's foggy dawn. Yet the shadow of the robbery stretched longer and darker. Scotland Yard called it the crime that keeps on killing. The bullion was melted, laundered, or hidden. But the blood, that kept flowing. Kenneth Noy sat in the garden of a rented villa near the Costa del Sol, watching the sea. Leaner, greyer, his eyes still cold as ice. Betrayals, investigations, and a murder trial. He'd survived them all. After killing DC John Fordham in 1985, he'd walked free, claiming self-defense. The tabloids called him a murderer. He called himself above the law. Now he lived as a businessman abroad. But London's shadow clung to him. His name was whispered in every corner of the underworld. Detective Boyce, long retired, kept his private dossiers. Photos, maps, old files. Each a fragment of a puzzle he was determined to solve. He knew the gold was mostly gone, but the curse lingered. "Follow the money," he'd say. "It always tells the truth." In 1995, he sent a memo. The case evolved beyond burglary. It's an infection. White-collar fraud, narcotics, offshore crime. The truth was undeniable. Men who touched the gold died, some violently, some mysteriously. Johnny the Lip Palmer, shot in 2015, survived but never forgot. The gold's influence persisted, seeping into legitimate businesses, funding drugs, corruption, and new crime waves. And still, the treasure's trail remained elusive. hidden in secret vaults, melted into jewelry, or buried deep in the earth. The empire grew, mutated, and spread its roots across the world, unstoppable. Because some secrets, they never die. The robbery began with 6 men and a warehouse near Heathrow. It ended with chaos, silence, and a trail of blood. Over the decades, more than 20 linked lives had been violently snuffed out, shot, disappeared, erased. Over half the gold remained missing, its fingerprints embedded in Britain's underworld, banks, and beyond. The gold was more than wealth. It was a seed, germinating betrayal, violence, and greed that spread like wildfire across generations. It had grown into a vast, shadowy forest, one that cast a long, dark shadow over the nation, a reminder that some secrets don't stay buried, and some crimes continue to haunt the land long after the loot is gone.